Very warm welcome to this webinar about MSc Global Ecology and Conservation. What we're going to do today is I'm going to sort of talk you through some aspects of the course, a bit more about course content, things such as what you might expect in terms of contact hours, perhaps a little bit about Cardiff if you're not familiar with it, and kind of give you a bit of a sense of the kind of people who'll be teaching the course. I'm guessing that might be about 25 minutes, something like that. And so there'll be plenty of time for questions. So in some ways, the idea is to kind of almost just to stimulate some of those questions. We've had one or two that have been sent through in advance. So what we'll do is you should have the option to submit questions at any point during the talk via the Q&A function. And then one or two of those may get dealt with by my colleague Anita during the talk, but if not, we'll cover those at the end. I'll also look to try and cover the ones that were sent in advance if they add any more to the ones that are actually raised during this session. Okay, so without further ado, I will load up the PowerPoint and we'll go through this. As I say, maybe about 25 minutes, something like that, and then there'll be plenty of time within the session for questions. So let me just do a quick screen share. Okay, so hopefully you can see that presentation. I assume someone will shout out or put something in the Q&A if for some reason you can't. So global ecology and conservation. Let's just give a little bit of background here. So the starting point here is, of course, to introduce myself. So I'm Ian Vaughan, I'm the course director, and I'm a reader in ecology at Cardiff University. And my real research interest is community ecology. So I'm a community ecologist first and foremost. So I'm interested in what things affect the range of different organisms we see in different parts of the world. I have particular interest looking at river systems, so interesting things such as how rivers respond to changing water quality, to changing climate and changing land use. But I also collaborate in a lot of other areas across ecology, and particularly around pollination and food webs. I do quite a lot of work on those topics as well. In terms of the MSc, as I say, I'm course lead, so try and sort of direct the whole, keep the whole show on the road, as it were. But I also teach the core Assessing Biodiversity and Ecosystems module as well. So that's background to me. A little bit of background to the course. So GEC, Global Ecology and Conservation, is currently in its 5th year. So you're potentially looking at starting in September, which would be its 6th year of running. And we developed this course to kind of really sort of train people up in the skills they might need for working in ecology and conservation. And by working, that could be anything from staying in academia, but going along towards being a researcher. It could be working for a conservation non-governmental organisation. It could be becoming an ecological consultant. But it's about trying to develop those skills, because a lot of degrees are quite sort of concept and theory based. So we've really focused on skills development and helping to train people up. And as I've already alluded to, it's a huge subject area. Lots of different areas where you might end up working within ecology and conservation after a master's course. So we've tried to kind of provide little bits to support you working in a whole range of different fields. And there are key components of the course you can tailor to your particular interests. And I'll return to that, I think, probably on the last slide. So the overall design of the course is to sort of mimic that kind of process you would naturally go through if you're trying to tackle problems in ecology and conservation in the wider environment. So the starting point is to go out and collect relevant information, relevant data, whether that's surveying the population of an endangered species, whether it's looking at the whole array of organisms which occur in an area, whether it's looking at the sort of the condition of different ecosystems, the extent of different habitats, whatever it might be. So that whole process starts with some sort of survey design and field data collection process. And we have our field skills module, which really focuses on that. Once that process is done, of course, there's then the need to interrogate the data you collect, to really understand what it tells you about biodiversity and what it tells you about how that's changing through time, how it's responding to changes in the environment, be they kind of potentially negative effects, things such as changing climate, albeit the response to, say, management interventions, and hopefully seeing some sort of improvement in conservation status. So there's a sort of a whole component of understanding what's going on in the environment, how it's changing, what the causes are, And then from that, that leads naturally to thinking about possible solutions to problems and developing management prescriptions. And so our course is kind of based around that general process with a module focusing very much on field skills, a couple of modules focusing on analysing, handling data, beginning to understand what's changing in the environment, and then on the back of that, a module focusing on developing conservation management prescriptions. Now that maps up in this sort of simple way across the academic year. So starting in late September or early October, the 4 core modules, the real sort of meat of the course, they occur between beginning of October, running up until roughly the Easter vacation. In addition to those 4 core modules, then have 2 optional modules, and those could run at pretty much any time through the academic year, depending on which modules they are, primarily in that October to Easter window. But if you opt to take the field course module, the field course is run in the summer, hence my kind of shaded part, if I get my mouse pointed up here, the shaded part here. And then there's the research project, which starts sort of with a few weeks after Easter and runs up until the beginning of September. So that's the basic kind of map of the year. What I'd like to do next is talk a little bit about the different modules, both the core modules and the likely optional modules, and just give you just a little bit of a flavour for what those involve. So, 4 core modules. First of these, led by Dr. Tom Bishop, is Field Skills for Ecology and Conservation. So this involves learning about a whole range of different sort of practical ideas around field sampling. So this takes in ways to design surveys, thinking about the logistics of and health and safety of field work, that side of it. So thinking about, before you even go out into the field, planning different surveys. It covers a range of different survey techniques, and that includes, as I've mentioned here, kind of perhaps the more traditional sort of techniques you might use in ecology, standard vegetation surveys, reptile surveys, those sorts of things, and also covers some of the important new methods, things such as eDNA sampling. That module also includes a component looking at ecological or environmental impact assessment and relevant legislation, so quite relevant, for example, if you were interested in going into ecological consultancy, and includes a GIS element as well. So if you've not done any or very little GIS prior to the course, there's some kind of introductory sessions to GIS within that module as well. Second module is the one that I run, Assessing Biodiversity and Ecosystems. And this is all about taking a broader view of biodiversity in the world around us and thinking not just about the kind of traditional ways we think about biodiversity in terms of things such as species richness or the particular species that are present, but also going beyond that. So thinking about things such as functional diversity, the range of different ecological and functional traits that organisms have, genetic, phylogenetic diversity, those sorts of measures as well, to give you kind of a much broader idea about the different ways in which biodiversity is quantified. That then leads naturally on to thinking about how diversity has changed, it's changing through time, and then potentially trying to work out what's changed within that, what's changed in the environment which is leading to changes in diversity. The third module here is Principles and Practice of Conservation Biology, and this is led by Professor Benoit Goossens, who's the head of our field centre out in Borneo. So that module, Benoit often ends up coming in doing online lectures. So while he's out in Malaysia, keeping the field station running, and sort of a range of his collaborators will come in and talk on that as well. And this covers a whole range of kind of key conservation issues, thinking about partly about the kind of techniques, management techniques you might use, the challenges of education and outreach. And also there's a sort of a degree of horizon scanning element within this, thinking about, well, okay, what might be future threats? And then this leads ultimately to writing a management plan. So that's the big assessment in that module, is putting together a management plan, typically for a particular species or a particular location. So kind of very much putting some of the things you learn across the course into practice there, and quite practical, useful skills. And then the fourth core module is data science, and it's led by Dr. Rob Thomas. And this is really all about giving you a sound grounding in how to handle data, be that for graphics to help present your data, be that for kind of quite formal statistical analyses, but also some of the other key skills that are required in the modern sort of research, well, not just research environment, but in the modern environment around archiving your data, archiving the kind of code you've used for analysis, so that people can really sort of, there's full transparency, people can see how you've analysed things, potentially build on what you've done. So those are the four core modules. So just to jump in and give you a tiny little flavour of one of those, I'll just grab a little bit from my own module in this instance. So with assessing biodiversity in ecosystems, quite a bit of the course is based around looking at a whole series of case studies of biodiversity assessment. So where you need to go out and look at data sets, be able to assess diversity and try and understand how it's changing in response to a changing environment. And one of the case studies we use a couple of times in the practicals is looking at coral reef fish diversity in the Seychelles. And so with this, we're interested in how that diversity is affected by the condition of the coral reefs. So this looks like a nice healthy coral reef, lots of corals, very sort of structurally complex habitat, lots of little niches for fish and other organisms to occupy. And obviously, in large parts of the world, the quality and condition of coral reefs has been degraded by things such as coral bleaching, invasive, destructive fishing methods, and other things. And that leads to that loss of complexity, death of corals, and often colonization by things such as macroalgae, things like seaweeds. So in our practicals, we look at some data that have been collected on fish of the Seychelles, the Seychelles rather. Yeah, so the Seychelles fish. And here we're looking at, I think it's about 130 species, something like that. And here we've got a phylogenetic tree showing how related they are and sort of really emphasizing the high diversity of species. And what we do is we link that to some measures looking at the condition of the reef and start sort of quantifying how diversity drops away as the reefs become more degraded. So my little plot in the corner here, this is measuring overall phylogenetic diversity, that sort of genetic level diversity in the community. And you can see that as the reefs getting more degraded, there comes a point at which suddenly the diversity of the fish community sort of plummets. And so in this way, this is the kind of sort of thing you might look at if you want to really understand, in this instance, how diversity is affected by degradation of the reefs. And the practical concludes by then going on and starting to actually map those data across the Seychelles, so we can see areas where, for example, here, the reefs are particularly depauperate in fish, other areas where the reefs appear to be, well, as close to pristine as they might be, where the diversity is very high. So that's the way that module works. Lots of real-world examples, looking at sort of ways in which we might assess diversity to answer key conservation questions. So moving on from the core modules, for this coming year, we anticipate offering 4 optional modules. So these are the 4 that we've offered this year, and you would select 2 from this list of 4. So the first of these is Advanced Research Methods, and it's led by Professor Paola Borri. And this sort of highlights the diversity of research that goes in across the School of Biosciences in Cardiff. So that's not just ecology and conservation, it's actually a much, much broader remit around the whole area of the life sciences. So that module gives you a taste of all these different things, but then critically, the assessments, a lot of the work in the module focuses on generic research skills, which are essential for ecology and conservation and, well, any other areas of research really. Things such as writing grant proposals. So that module gives you, a much broader view going way outside ecology and conservation, but then, which is valuable in its own right, but then comes back to giving you that kind of, there's real teaching you those practical skills which are directly applicable to ecology and conservation. We have the Field Research and Placement module led by Islam Sovi, and this is sort of a 2-part module. So it comprises a field course which runs in the summer, and those sort of are typically somewhere around about a week and a half to 2 weeks in duration. Could be in the UK, could be at various overseas locations. And then also a work placement of something like 2 weeks. And typically the student will set that up, and that's a really good opportunity to gain experience, perhaps in an area you don't know so well, develop contacts for potential job opportunities after the course. People go and do a whole range of different things with that placement, and I'm happy to talk a bit more about that in the questions later on. And then finally, our 4th optional module is Frontiers in Water, which is led by Professor Isabel Durantz, who leads our University Research Institute on Water. And it's sort of the structure of that module is very much about a whole series of invited speakers coming in and talking about kind of very much cutting edge contemporary issues around water. Now that module is shared with the MSc Water in a Changing World, which is run by our Earth Sciences department. So that's a very strongly interdisciplinary module. Some bits of it are specifically around ecology and biodiversity. Others are much more general water issues. And so that gives you a really good grounding in that broader multidisciplinary field. So that's our choice of 4. And then finally, in terms of the modules, the research project. And as I say, this runs for something like about 4 months. So typically kind of roughly May until the beginning of September. And our aim with the course is to try and be as flexible as possible and offer as wide a range of projects that appeal to our students as we possibly can. So obviously there are limits to some things we're physically able to do based on the expertise in Cardiff, but we can generally cover a pretty broad swathe of things. And down the bottom in this blue box, I've put in, some sort of title, some sort of topics that have occurred in the last couple of years, but there've been many, many more. This is just really to illustrate the diversity of research projects that go on here. I mean, in general, we're kind of keen to supervise anything from sort of perhaps almost like a theoretical ecology type project where it's very much more about concepts and ideas, through very practical projects, going out collecting field data or working in the lab, all the way through to something which perhaps is more relevant to, say, an ecological consultancy, where maybe the project could be sort of testing different survey methods and comparing those, for instance. So lots and lots of scope to kind of tailor the projects. As I say, they could be lab, field, or data-based. They could be in the UK, or potentially they could run overseas. And our idea with this is that you can your project will be sort of worked out in sort of different ways. So we kind of encourage staff to give ideas for projects, so either project titles or general research areas, to encourage students to chat to them. Equally, students can just approach staff completely out of the blue and talk to them about possible projects. And if students are able to co-develop a project with a member of staff, I mean that's absolutely great. We love supporting that option because then students are really invested in the work. But equally, some people, don't have such a clear idea about what they want to do, or perhaps don't feel comfortable about that approach. They can pick something off the list, perhaps something like that. So it can be done in different ways. Equally, a range of external organisations will also suggest projects as well. So, for example, this year, I think we've had project suggestions from the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. I'm co-supervising a student working with our SPB this year. We get ideas from Butterfly Conservation. I think the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust have sent through ideas before. So a range of organisations will also make suggestions of projects, and provided we've got a member of staff in Cardiff who's able to co-supervise those, then potentially that works well. And in general, we encourage students to make connections with outside organisations where it's possible to do some sort of co-supervised model, which then gives them a really good research experience and also the opportunity to develop links with external organisations and, who knows, potential job opportunities down the line. Okay, so that's the academic side. I'm just going to sort of give perhaps 2 or 3 slides about sort of some points about student experience, and then we'll kind of wrap up and I'll take questions at that stage. So it might be that some of you on this call are already Cardiff students, you're very, very familiar with the place. But for those of you who aren't, this first slide is just to emphasise that Cardiff is a really great place to study. It's a really great place to be a student. So it's a really, really friendly city. It's I think about 350,000 people, but the centre of the city, anything from where the university's based, where most of the sort of accommodation that students tend to stay in is, the city centre, a lot of the facilities, those are all within something like a 20 or 30-minute walk or cycle. So the city's quite compact, or at least the broader city centre is. Lots of green space. We've got the River Taff running right through the middle of it. It's a very lovely city. It's a very nice place to live. If we sort of zoom out a little bit and look where Cardiff is in the broader area, in the south of Wales here, you've got lots of really great countryside and really interesting wildlife sites nearby. So anything from the south, get my mouse pointer to appear again, the South Glamorgan coast down here, very little appreciated outside South Wales, but it's a really, really beautiful coastline. Go a bit further afield, you get to the sand dune systems of Merthyr Mawr and Kenfig Dunes, which are really important, some of our most important wildlife sites. They're really kind of very, very important nature reserves there. Go a little bit further west, just beyond Swansea, and you get across to the Gower Peninsula, very, very beautiful, potentially Pembrokeshire if you go even further afield. Or head north, up through the valleys, and up to Bannow-Brecainog National Park, what used to be the Brecon Beacons. That's about 3/4 of an hour's drive. You can actually get a bus, I believe, that will drop you off on the main road here near the highest point near Pen y Fan. And then, of course, easy to get across from there. You can get into the Wye Valley with some really spectacular ancient woodlands. And then, Cardiff's very well connected towards the Midlands, towards London. Of course, Bristol's just across the Severn Estuary. It's a really nice sort of broader environment to live in. One thing that people often ask about is contact hours. And this is actually a surprisingly difficult question to answer. And that's because the timetable changes from week to week, exactly what's in it. And of course, it depends on what optional modules you take. So just to give you some sort of kind of rough idea of the kind of number of contact hours. So typically the autumn semester, sort of leading up to kind of around about Christmas time, you might be looking at something like 12 hours contact time per week, and then around about nine hours in spring. So it's slightly heavier in the autumn. And the reason for that is that we front load 2 of our modules. So we have an intensive week of data science quite early on in the autumn term to really kind of get people up to speed with working with data and that side of things. So that will really help with other modules in the course, and obviously the research project later on. So on the basis that students incoming to the course, some will have done a lot of data analysis and be very happy with that side and already have effectively like a head start in data science. Others won't have that. So we have this intensive week to really sort of help those students in particular to kind of get everybody up and running. We also include we sort of pack a lot of the field skills module in to the first kind of sort of month to 6 weeks of the academic year. And that's simply because generally, tempting fate, generally the weather's better. Things such as reptiles are still out and about at that stage. So it's a better time for field trips. So we have more contact hours in that autumn semester because of those 2 modules in particular. Obviously, in terms of overall contact time, optional modules will then add some more hours on top of that. Now, different modules, some of the optional modules run in the autumn, some run in the spring semester, some stretch through both. So depending on which optional modules you choose, that will increase the hours in one or both of those 2 semesters, autumn and spring. So to try and give a sense of what that means in practice, it probably means you'd be looking at something like 3 to 4 days a week with some sort of contact time teaching on campus through the autumn semester and 2 to 3 days in spring. But, I can't emphasize enough that that's quite variable from week to week. So that's not an absolute, but just to give you kind of a rough idea of what that looks like in practice. Aside from that, obviously everyone gets assigned a personal tutor, and typically you'd meet up with them about 5 times a year. Obviously on top of that, they're the first port of call if there are any problems or anything you want to discuss about the course. They're always really good and very helpful. So have that dealings with a personal tutor. We also add other things into the course. So there are a few sessions around things such as preparing CVs. There's it's not quite a careers fair, sort of a careers event type thing, and a chance to meet some potential employers and a few other things like that through the year. And then this is my final slide. So I mentioned at the start that one of the things we really want students to do, and indeed many students have been adept at doing this, is to tailor their course as much as possible to reflect what they'd like to do afterwards. So here are 3 possible things you might look at for a longer term career after a year on MSc Global Ecology and Conservation. So it might be that you're kind of really interested in academia and you want to stay you want to go on to a PhD afterwards, so kind of some sort of research route. It might be, and indeed a lot of our graduates have gone this way, it might be that you want to go into ecological consultancy, so maybe that's kind of where you're thinking. Or maybe you're more interested in becoming a conservation practitioner and, say, working for a conservation NGO. So what I've done here is start to look at some of the things on the course that you could sort of tailor to match where you want to go next. So obviously I've talked about the optional modules already. So perhaps if you want to stay in academia, you could pick those depending on your research interests. Perhaps the choice there isn't critical. If you want to go into consultancy, you'd probably go for a UK-based course and then try and use that field course time to sort of work on perhaps practicing your survey methods or your identification skills for a particular group of organisms, which could then sort of support your application for a consultancy work. If you're going into conservation practice, well, potentially a field course could be valuable, and then maybe you'd sort of focus on the science communication module, because communication could be particularly valuable in that instance. So that's the first way you might tailor the course. Second way is that some pieces of coursework will give you sort of options as to kind of perhaps different questions or different scenarios you might address. And one of the ones is in the field skills module, where one of the assessments is looking at designing a field survey. And there are two scenarios, one of which is thinking about it as part of a research project, and the other one is thinking of it as part of an ecological impact assessment, so thinking about a consultancy type scenario. So of course you could pick whichever one you want there. So going towards the research scenario, if you're interested in research, for consultancy, you might, if you're interested in consultancy, you'd go more towards that sort of option. Then the field course and placement module. Now this of course has got, field course and placement module. Not only have you got the field, think about where you might go for a field course, but also where might you do a work placement, given roughly 2 weeks of time to spend in a placement. And I should say that with that wouldn't necessarily have to be a 2-week block. That could be sort of spread out into much sort of smaller pieces through the year, for instance. It depends on what sort of organisation you are working with. So, you might be that you want to work with a researcher and another university or research organisation if you were thinking about staying in research. Obviously, trying to shadow an ecological consultant if consultancy is what you're thinking of. And again, lots of students do get placements with consultancies. And, a placement with an NGO would make a lot of sense if you were thinking about going into practice, conservation practice. And then finally, the research project. I mean, obviously, this is a big component of the degree. So you can sort of think about, as far as possible, tailoring that to your interests. So if you're thinking about going into research, it may be you've got a clear idea of the kind of research you want to go into. So it may be you want to do a research project in that area, or perhaps focus on developing particular skills that would be useful longer term. So let's say that you haven't done very much field work up till now, very much focusing on a field-based project could be a priority. Or, if you're thinking, molecular skills could be valuable, it might be that you want to then do a research project during your MSc, which is focusing on developing that kind of molecular side. And of course, developing, potentially reaching out to other organizations to develop new collaborations. If you think about consultancy, well, it would seem obvious, it seems sort of sensible that a project could focus on, really trying to work up and improve your identification skills of a particular group of organisms, which might be relevant to consultancy. So birds, for instance, could be valuable, doing a bat-based project, perhaps, focusing on survey methods, site assessments, those sorts of things. So you could do a research project, but it could bring in some of those elements. And then finally, if you think about going into sort of a conservation organisation, well, addressing a really practical conservation issue is, seems like a very obvious one. So, for instance, the project that I'm supervising this year, co-supervising with the RSPB, is looking at the effect of, grazing on salt marshes on a range of different bird species, and that's got the potential to lead to some quite specific management implications. So that's just to give you a flavour, just to kind of emphasise that there are all sorts of things on the course where you could sort of, make particular choices, tailor things to kind of, to fit with your interest and really just help you get the most out of a year studying for ecology and conservation. Okay, so I think that's quite enough for me on the background talk. I think that's kind of kept to roughly 25 minutes. I'll come out of this now and have a look and see what's coming on the Q&A. So let me just stop sharing my screen. Okay, so the question and answer box is open, so feel free to put questions in that, submit questions. Okay, so one's come in straight away. So are there exams for the modules? The answer is no. So as it stands, none of the core modules has an examination, and our current choice of optional modules, none of those have exams in either. It's all coursework based. So another question here. Would you potentially get the opportunity to carry out research at the Borneo site? The answer is potentially yes. So I think we've had a few projects that have been based out in Borneo. The, the the key thing is sort of developing a suitable project and the amount of demand. There's usually only sort of perhaps one or two students a year who might go out and actually do a research project out there. So that probably means there isn't a problem with demand, but obviously if in a particular year we get, I don't know, 10 people who are desperate to do a project in Borneo, we wouldn't have the capacity to have that many people doing research projects. But yes, the bottom line is, yes, there is definitely the potential to do projects out at our field station, our Diagarang field station out in Borneo. Okay, so I have a keen interest in plants. Is there much of a focus on this in this master's? Um, there certainly are distinct plant elements. The key thing, actually, the biggest one of those is in fact during our field skills module, we have a day, or is it a couple? I think it's actually a couple of days now where Dr. Tim Rich comes in, who's kind of, well, arguably the kind of the greatest living field botanist in Britain at the moment, and he comes in and teaches vegetation survey methods. So we have Tim coming in, so we have a couple of dedicated days around, well, a mixture of phase one, but also national vegetation classification, helps with plant identification as well. So we've got a bit of time which is devoted to plants. Through the rest of the course, in terms of the standard taught modules, there isn't a huge focus on plants. There is some, clearly some comes into the course throughout. Realistically, there's probably more animal focused. But for someone with a keen interest in plants, an obvious thing would be to do a plant-based research project. Lots of scope for that, looking at plant ecology. And again, one or two of the other assessments might allow you to bring in some more plant-focused ideas. That work placement could be with, I don't know, let's say with Plant Life or the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland or something like that. So in terms of the sort of the organised talk content, there are a few key things, but it's not a huge plant focus, but then lots of scope to sort of customise the course, tailor it to that sort of vegetation vegetation focus. Okay, so when does the autumn semester end and spring semester begin? This is always a slightly tricky question. Loosely speaking, well, I think officially semesters end around about the end of January is the sort of the switch. We don't strictly follow them on the MSc course. They're sort of tailored more for the undergraduate courses. So, for example, my figures where I was giving you kind of autumn and spring contact hours, I was taking autumn to being start of the course up until Christmas and then start of January through to Easter. So those are, for the purposes of the MSc, I would sort of talk in autumn and spring in those terms. Officially, it's the end of, I think somewhere around about the end of January is the change. Right, how much guidance or structure is there to the research project? That's a really good question. And I would say first and foremost that the amount of guidance and structure would probably be tailored to the particular student. So all of the all of the projects, you have your own supervisor for them. Typically staff will supervise 1 to 3 students. So, they should have plenty of time to sort of meet with you regularly, to guide you, to help train you up and all of that. Some students and some projects obviously require a lot more structure. Others require less structure and can give sort of, the student a freer rein. So I suppose so ultimately it's a slightly tricky question to answer in that sense. I would say there's scope to provide plenty of support, plenty of guidance, plenty of structure. Equally, some people either don't sort of want that, and the project doesn't need it, in which case you'd be allowed sort of space to breathe and work on your project with quite a lot of freedom. I hope that answers your question. Please, by all means, submit a follow-up. As I said, it's a slightly difficult one because there isn't, every project's different, every student's different. So we offer equal opportunities in terms of support for the projects, but day to day, it may be that some projects need more structure, others less so. Okay, so are there many overseas research placement opportunities for the final project through the university? Potentially, yes. So for the research project, there's a research budget attached to each project, so there's some money available to go overseas. So to do an overseas project, what you would need is some sort of organisation that would be willing to host you, to work with, and also a Cardiff supervisor to provide that kind of academic supervision. I honestly don't know what numbers we've had doing projects overseas. We've certainly had a few over the years, so it's sort of a minority of students, but the potential's there. The opportunity to get involved with different organisations and get a really good research experience and do sort of useful work is something we would encourage and support as much as we can. So there aren't any that are sort of set up ready. Generally, it would be a case of having discussions with staff in Cardiff and external organisations to try and get something set up. But yes, so we certainly support people doing that, and there is some money available. The projects have a research budget that could be used to help with that. Right. If you take the field course module, is there an assignment when you get home? Would this clash with the research project? It's a good question. I mean, obviously there is a clash insofar as the field courses do run during the research project period, and we do that because the MSc research and the field courses actually, the students piggyback on our undergraduate field courses. You do something different as an MSc student, but ultimately you go at the same time. That keeps the cost down. It means we can offer a wider range of possible courses rather than perhaps only being able to say, this is the only field course we run. So in that sense, there's a bit of there's a certain overlap. For next year, and this, I think this has been rubber stamped now, but you'll forgive me if I'm just being slightly cautious, but all being well, there shouldn't be any significant assessment once you get back. So a final part of the assessment is likely to be an oral presentation of kind of, it's not a full research project you do there. It's a bit like a research proposal. It's starting to develop research ideas. And I believe for this coming year, so if you took that module in this coming academic year, the assessment would finish with a presentation which would either be within the field course or very, very soon afterwards. So there wouldn't be that process of writing up a large report. There wouldn't be lots of assessment to do once you get back. So to answer that question, obviously, there's a little bit of a clash because of when the field courses run during the wider research project window, but actually outside of the course themselves, the kind of the 1.5 to 2 weeks, there should be very little clash. Okay, so for a moment, we've kind of caught up with those questions on the Q&A. One or two others were submitted earlier, I gather, and unfortunately, they were only sent to me just before the session started. So I will just have a look and see if there are any here to do. So it says, is it possible to elaborate on the optional module content and how they are assessed? So also I've talked a little bit about the optional modules. In terms of assessments, if I can just do this off the top of my head. So the advanced research methods one, I believe it was a grant proposal, and I think is it a presentation, the other element? I can't remember what the second element is of that. So you have to forgive me for that. I'd have to look that up. Field course and placement module, you write, excuse me, you write a sort of a reflective diary about your placement. So something about, what you learned and the challenges on your placement. And then for the field course itself, there's a mark given by staff for your general kind of performance on the course. And also this sort of a presentation element will be the other component. As I say, that's a slight change from previous years. So that's not quite set in stone yet, but that is what the assessment for the field course is due to be for this coming academic year. And then I'm not 100% sure what they are for water and frontiers in water. I think one of them is a podcast you do, or sort of like a little video, a little blog type thing. And is the second one a research poster? If you want specific details of those, please email me afterwards and I will double check. So one or two of these are kind of new modules, or the assessments change slightly for the coming year. So I'm not quite as don't know the detail quite as well as I used to. In terms of the content, obviously I've talked a little bit about the content, but again, please, if whoever asked that question, do put something more in the Q&A now or email me as follow-up, and I'm more than happy to provide more information on those. Right, I see another one's coming on the Q&A. Is this Masters from September to June? No, this Masters runs from end of September, sort of beginning of October, all of the way through to the beginning of September the following year. So it's just under 12 months in duration. So in terms of other questions which were submitted ahead, so we've talked a little bit about optional modules. How do you apply for the Masters course if currently studying biosciences at Cardiff? I think I saw that question coming in and it was answered. So I think you go through the standard application portal, but it's streamlined if you're already an undergraduate here. I think it's a sort of a faster application process. How many person hours are there per week on average? Well, we've covered that. And then finally, are there any funding opportunities for this programme? I have to say, I'm not 100% sure what the situation is in terms of any additional funding for this programme. For Masters in general, not this specific one. There are occasionally some scholarships. I don't know whether there are any applying for this, any relevant for this coming academic year. Searching around the Cardiff website is a good option for that. I know that for students who've studied in Cardiff previously, there is a percentage reduction off the cost of the fees. I can't remember, is it 20%, something like that? There's some sort of reduction in the costs as well. Yes, so I said, I'm sorry, I can't go into any more detail about the funding opportunities because I'm not across the detail on that. But we can always, if people have got specific questions about that, by all means, do follow up by email, and we'll try and provide more information at that stage. Okay, so back on the live Q&A. So how many people attend the course each year? Most years we've had around about sort of 30 students on the course, sort of high 20s, low 30s. I guess we're looking at sort of similar numbers for the coming year. And that seems to be a nice size where, it's a lively course, but it's not sort of so large. It's kind of, it's not so large that it means you don't get as much sort of contact time. And that's the key thing, is that with a course like this, you get a lot more sort of interaction with staff, a lot more contact time as possible at undergraduate level. Okay, and then the next question is, when do you anticipate applications will end for this course? Oh, that's a really good question. Based on previous years, and as I said, this is our 6th sort of application cycles. This will be applications for the 6th year the course has run. Based on previous years, I would imagine that the application process will stay open until sort of early summer. But I'm not suggesting you should apply tomorrow if you're thinking of doing it, if you're still thinking about it. But clearly the earlier you do that, the better, just to be on the safe side. So if we had a real sort of sudden flurry of applications, we might have to close a little bit earlier than that. But we've been pretty consistent in rates of recruitment, rates of applications coming in previous years. I think we're following that same sort of rate this year. So as I say, I would suggest kind of early summerish sometime. It should stay until at least that sort of time. Okay, so I think we've caught up. I think we've covered the questions that were sent in advance, and now we're kind of just dealing with the main live QA. So coming from undergrad, the key thing here is the entry requirements for the course. So we ask people to have a 2-1 degree class. So beyond that, there's no minimum marks. You could, have a mark that's at the lower end of that sort of category. That would be absolutely fine. So the basic entry requirement is the equivalent. Well, it's either a 2-1 from a UK university or an equivalent level from sort of an overseas qualification. Potentially, occasionally we get people coming in where they've either come from a different sort of subject area. So we generally say we look for degrees, around the kind of the biological and environmental sciences. Sometimes people come in with very different academic backgrounds. And so in those instances, we will sort of look at those on a case-by-case basis, looking at things such as other relevant experience people might have. So evidence that they've got some of the skills needed for the course, they've demonstrated their sort of aptitude for the course. So we do try and support people coming from sort of quite different academic backgrounds as much as possible. Okay, I think we've actually managed to catch up on the questions. We've got a few more minutes, so please do feel free if you have any other questions about the course. I mean, as I say, equally, if you're like me, you go to a meeting or a presentation, and it's only afterwards, once it's over, that then you think of all the questions you wish you had asked. So by all means, do email questions into us after this, later today or over the coming days or weeks, and we'll be happy to answer those. Okay, we'll give it another minute or two in case anyone has any other remaining questions, and then if not, we'll wrap up. So, as I say, anything else you want to ask about, do put it in the Q&A in the next minute or two. Otherwise, we'll kind of wrap up at that stage. Whilst we wait and see if anyone has anything else to ask about, I mean, I hope you found that useful today. I hope you found it interesting. I hope it's given a little bit more insight into the course. Always difficult to know exactly what to put into these kind of webinars, but hopefully that gives you a real flavour, sort of that plus the Q&A. I hope that started to address some of the questions that you have. As I said, by all means, follow up on anything else. Email biosci-msc at Cardiff or email me directly. I don't think my email address is actually on the talk, but if you send it to biosci-msc, it'll be forwarded through to me. Yeah, any questions about that, do send them through. Hopefully we'll get to see many of you in the autumn. Look forward to actually welcoming you onto the course. But as I say, any questions on the back of this, do get in touch. Any more questions? Equally, if you've accepted an offer or you accept an offer over the coming months and have any questions in preparation for coming to Cardiff in the autumn, equally do email us about those as well, and we'll do whatever we can to help, or even if we can't help, hopefully steer you in the correct direction. So I think as nothing else has come in by way of questions, I think we'll wrap up there. But again, thank you very much for coming. I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope you found it interesting, and hopefully we'll get to meet many of you in the autumn. Thank you very much.